Hello everyone. After my Augusta video, I think I have enough time to do about one resonator analysis before Iono drops, so I decided to take on the challenge of doing just one of the more requested resonators that people in the comments have been asking for. And that, of course, if you're watching the video, will be Changli. I will recommend that before we continue, if you haven't watched my video on Jinzhou, it would be good to watch it, as both Jinzhou and Changli's symbolism goes hand in hand. They both occupy the Mount Firmament 1.1 update, so there's quite a lot of overlap in terms of symbolism between them, and it'll be a much better viewing experience if you watch Jinzhou's first. Besides that, I'd like to just also as well give a quick thanks as always for the consistent support on my videos, and of course, without further ado, I'll put a glossary up on the next page. If you haven't played Changli's story yet, just do be aware that there will be spoilers ahead. As is what is basically custom now, I will be beginning Changli's analysis by first going through the meaning of her name. Similar to Jinzhou's name, Changli's name is a shortened Chinese compound, which basically means it's two words put together to form one more advanced combined meaning. In this case, we need to separate Changli's name to two parts, Chang and Li. The first component, Chang, is actually quite simple. It's the Chinese word for long, basically, and in the context of the shortened compound Changli, it conveys not just actual length, but also of endurance, of eternity and immortality, which you can probably tell is very relevant to her symbolism. It's pretty simple, right? However, when we get to the second part, Li, this is where it gets really interesting, because the Li part of Changli's name actually comes from the I-Ching Chinese divination system, which you might remember from my Jinzhou video. But as a quick refresher, if you haven't watched that video, no worries. I-Ching is a divination or a sort of fortune-telling system, I guess, which uses the bagua or 8 trigrams, which each represent a cardinal direction and an element. These can then further be separated into 64 hexagrams, which make up the entire I-Ching. What's interesting is that Changli's Li is actually both a trigram and an hexagram, with the trigram Li, to the surprise of probably nobody, being iconic of the fire elements, but also of the direction of the south. So again, let's talk about the trigram first before we get to the hexagram. The Li trigram, representing fire, is symbolic of clarity and making sense of things. Just like how fire can light up the darkness, Li represents the ability to discern facts and understanding from the midst of chaos, which is iconic to Changli's character as someone who basically does the same thing as her name basically says. She's an enigmatic advisor that tries to figure out the secrets to a chaotic world plunged in the throes of the Lament. However, as we said before, there is more to the I-Ching than just this. When you combine two Li trigrams, you will actually get the Li hexagram, otherwise known as hexagram 30, which, roughly translated, is basically just named the clinging. Clinging as in to cling onto something. And it's also, quite coincidentally, of course it's not, a pun for the yellow bird, namely the yellow bird of the south. Just like fire has to cling onto fuel, such as wood, to keep burning, the Li hexagram talks about how things have to cling to each other to function. Fire, for example, must cling to wood. Trees must cling to the earth. The sun must cling to the moon. And perhaps most importantly, in a lot of Chinese works, the Li hexagram is used to symbolize how civilization must cling to war. As a bit of foreshadowing, I need to say that this specific point that I just went through is going to be very important later. So please remember this, because trust me, By the end, everything, and I really do mean everything, will come full circle. One of the more obvious aspects of Changli's symbolism that you might even be able to tell right off the bat is the use of firebirds in her symbolism and design philosophy. Even though it seemed easy, to be honest, trying to find research for this on the surface, I actually got pretty confused by this specific aspect. And the reason for this is because Changli seems to be based on multiple legends of both the Fenghuang and the vermilion bird, and eventually I just had to conclude that essentially Changli is a sort of amalgamation of both of these. In essence, what I've basically boiled it down to is that Changli is symbolized by the Fenghuang and the vermilion bird at the same time. And I think it's appropriate to go through these one by one, because even though they're similar, they're rather different. So we'll quickly start off with the Fenghuang. The Fenghuang is a Chinese firebird, which is pretty commonly associated with the vermilion bird, but is actually a very different and separate entity. It's seen as the ruler of all birds, and the Fenghuang is usually seen as a bird having come from the sun, and oftentimes being depicted as carrying a fireball. What's important, however, is that in Chinese legends, the Fenghuang only makes an appearance during eras of stability and peace, which means that seeing a Fenghuang essentially symbolizes an ultimate form of prosperity. When we consider that Changli came from the capital to help Jinhsi, and helped in ushering the peace after the historical Battle of the Crescent in Jinzhou's lore, it actually matches up pretty nicely. Basically, wherever Changli goes, prosperity will follow. Because of this, the Fenghuang are often thought to appear during new eras of rebirth, such as the ascension of emperors, which you see actually in-game, because Jinzhou eventually ascends to the position of magistrate, of course, to herald a new era. To further this, when you look at Changli's character story, for example, a young Jinzhou is only answered by Changli when she says that what she wishes for is to bring peace and prosperity to the people of Jinzhou, answering that she will help to fulfill her goal if that, and only that, is her wish. As a child, we see through the sonorosphere that Changli also had the exact same wish, even further tying her in with the Fenghuang. However, there's a little bit more to this. One of the very interesting things about the Fenghuang is that although, technically speaking, it's not gender specific as a mythical beast, its legend over time has been sort of shaped to be iconic of the feminine yin energy. This is very important because Fenghuang are often depicted as existing side by side with dragons, which are symbolic of the male yang energy. I'm sure you can basically tell where this is going, but the duality of Changli and Jinzhou as one of the Fenghuang and the Longwang, of bird queens and dragon kings, is not only represented perfectly in Chinese legend, but also within the characters and the game story itself. The vermilion bird, on the other hand, is quite similar, but is more focused on Changli in different ways to the Fenghuang. The vermilion bird is one of the four symbols of the Chinese constellations, as it represents fire and the south, hence why the Li hexagram in the I-Ching, which we just talked about, has an alternate meaning of the firebird. It basically refers to the vermilion bird, which is something that I suppose you could say equates to a sort of Chinese parallel of the phoenix. It symbolizes many similar things to Fenghuang, such as prosperity and strength, but the key aspect where it differs from, and is more akin to the Western phoenix, is that it embodies the idea of rebirth through fire. In this, we can see that the vermilion bird, and Changli in extension, employs an idea of using fire to burn things away so they can be seen clearer or reborn, similar to how she burns away the sonorosphere at the end of her quest, or how she is reborn as Changli when her master gives her a new name. When you even see her story, you can see how she can overclock her forte at the cost of her life force, very similar to the vermilion bird in Chinese legend. Her gameplay and design is also very reminiscent of the vermilion bird, with the feathers and fire a rather obvious parallel. These two Chinese legends essentially combine to form an amalgamation of Changli's design, character, and symbolism. Like the Fenghuang and the vermilion bird, she will use fire to burn away all that obstructs her truth, guiding both the Dragon King and the world at large to a prosperous and harmonious future. Within the companion quest, Changli gives Rover an item called the Feather Pendant, which is paired to her cherished item, the Blaze Feather, which protects Rover from her flames and establishes a connection between them both. The description of the item states that, in bedtime stories once told to a young girl, a fire-born phoenix would bestow its most precious tail feather upon the person it held most dear. This is a reference to the Fenghuang feather, which, in Chinese folklore, the bird would often gift as a token of prosperity and protection. However, Fenghuang feathers themselves are also intensely symbolic beyond just this. The Fenghuang feather is traditionally made up of 5 colors, of which 4 are present on both the feather pendant and Changli's blaze feather: black, white, red, green, and yellow. These colors are symbolic of the 5 virtues of Confucianism, which Changli, as you can probably guess, is iconic of. Black is iconic of Len, of benevolence and humanity. White is iconic of Yi, of honesty. Red is iconic of Zi, or knowledge. Green is iconic of Xing, of integrity and faithfulness. And finally, yellow is iconic of Li, of morality and manners. These virtues are not only embedded in her character, but also in her 3rd and 4th character stories that tell the story of Changli's childhood in Jinzhou and her relationship with the Yanchen bookstore, where you can see her enjoyment of classic Chinese texts, and, of course, the problem that kind of follows in that story. Within the story and her growth, it can be seen how Changli embodies all of these virtues in some capacity. Just like the Fenghuang she embodies, she will carry these virtues and pass them on to the next generation.
Alone, yet maturing through stumbles. Later on, she became someone else's teacher. She taught the future leader this: to guide conscience and secure prosperity for the people, to continue lost teachings of past sages and establish peace for all. I will be the torchbearer, for one person can't rid the world of chaos alone. One day, a future of prosperity and lasting peace will arrive.
Within the beginning of Changli's quest, you see an elder storyteller tell a story of a woodcutter and the secret to immortality on Mount Firmament, something that is retold by Changli after you meet her for the first time. It tells a story of a woodcutter watching a game of Weiqi, played between 2 gurus. This story, which is very important to the rest of Changli's story at large, is very obviously based on a real Chinese legend, which is known as Lankeshan, which very roughly translates to the Mountain of the Rotten Axe Handle. Though the story has many versions, which Changli herself actually mentions when she talks about how legends are changed and twisted over time, the general flow of the story is this. A woodcutter goes into the mountain looking for wood for his axe, and on his way he gets lost and stumbles upon 2 strange people playing a match of Go, or Weiqi. Stopping to watch the game, he is offered a date, which essentially appeases his hunger, and after finally looking up in what feels like an hour, he looks at his axe handle to find that it has rotted to dust. The two players that he was watching have disappeared, and when he descends the mountain, he finds that his town has completely changed, and no one knows of him. In essence, in many versions of the legend of Lankeshan, the woodcutter is stated to have witnessed a game between two immortals, and to have been caught in a sort of time loop that basically ruins his life. It's a story that warns about the dangers of immortality, that the greed for eternal life is a costly affair, as you can see within Changli's story, where you try and resolve the problem of Wuling and Wuli. When you think about it a little further as well, Mount Firmament as a map is also quite obviously based on the Lankeshan. We went over in our analysis of Jinzhou how the map symbolism of snow, sunlight, and the Jinzhou essentially inspire the map, but what we didn't really talk about was the time freezing and temporal disruptions, which are a huge aspect of the map and its gameplay as well. As you can probably imagine, this element of the map is very clearly a reference to the Lankeshan itself. Similar to woodcutter watching a game, Mount Firmament's time is also slowed or frozen, with the fate of Jinzhou in Jinzhi's quest being trying to stop the disruptions in time. As such, the elder story denotes that the story of the Lankeshan is not just a story, but a legend of Mount Firmament itself. The resolution of the temporal disruptions on the mountain within Changli's quest is also iconic of the woodcutter's dilemma. Wuling and Wuli, utilizing the temporal disruptions, represent the price of immortality that is iconic of the Lankeshan legend. While we first hear of the Lankeshan legend with the elder storyteller at the beginning of Changli's story, we hear a version of the story that is rather iconic with the real-life legend, as we've already gone through. However, when you meet Changli for the first time, you hear about her own version of the story, a reference to how the actual legend has many different versions from many different authors. Throughout the story, we learn that the focus of Changli's version of the legend tells of the Weiqi games played between a pre-memory wipe rover and Changli's master, Shen Miao, who is a Taoist cultivator in the story. Within this, they supposedly create a legendary game record that can provide the ultimate truth and revelation to solving problems, which is something very important that we will discuss later. Within the frame of this legend, Changli's story is told, how she, as an orphan, was raised and taught by her master before ascending to power herself. Within her character and story, the highlight of the woodcutter's legend is the game of Go, or Weiqi, as it is referred to in-game, as it becomes a much more important element over the woodcutter's version of the story. Oftentimes known as Chinese chess, it's a game that hinges on being able to capture more territory than your opponents. As a game, it is symbolic of basically anything to do with strategy, of balance, of intellect, of foresight. If you look within her story, Changli's master essentially taught her all she knows through games of Weiqi, and the game in itself is symbolic of her character as a cunning strategist and advisor. However, one thing you may notice is that Weiqi, as a game in general, is not where the symbolism ends. Throughout her story and cherished items, specific boards of Weiqi are constantly displayed, of which are critically important, and symbolic for not only Changli's story, but also potentially the future story of Wuthering Waves. It's similar to how in many other works of media, chess is oftentimes used to describe situations, and as such, it is important that now we analyze these different boards of Weiqi. I would like to say very quickly that many of the symbolic interpretations of the following Weiqi boards have been assisted by Weiqi on YouTube. Without his videos and explanations after asking, I wouldn't have been able to really confirm any of my findings, so I have many thanks to give in terms of the following Weiqi sections. Within the game board as most frequently seen throughout Changli's story, being the match between Rover and Changli's master, Shengmao, we see a fascinating array of symbolism at play. Nicknamed by the watching woodcutter as a secret to immortality, this particular board, which I'll show on the screen real quick, is an example of an eternal life, or what I like to call an immortality situation. Within this game, the fight within the top left corner of the board is the one that will dictate the outcome. Within this sector, both white and black essentially take turns trading positions infinitely, as if any side dares to break from the cycle, they will lose. Essentially what this means is that this game will last for perpetuity, and like the idea of clinging within the Li hexagram of the I-Ching previously, it is a game completely dependent on both sides of white and black, depending on each other to function. Essentially, by having a game that lasts forever based on the reciprocal moves of white and black, the legendary game board of both Rover and Changli's master is doomed to repeat forever and be unfinished, as she states within the story. This is symbolic of the woodcutter's symbolic secret of immortality within the legend of the Lankeshan, by essentially creating a Weiqi game that is impossible to end. Even though the previously discussed board can be interpreted from the view of the woodcutter and the concept of immortality, I personally think that this specific game board can tell us a much greater message beyond just the boundaries of Changli's story. Throughout the mission, it is constantly mentioned that this specific game board functions as a sort of solution and ultimate truth for the problems of the world, with the master saying quite forebodingly that the results of this game will decide the fate of Jinzhou, of even the entire world. Now, what I'm going to say is heading into a bit of speculation territory, I feel. So please take this and anything I'm going to say from this point on with a grain of salt. Do you remember that when we were discussing the Li hexagram that I told you to memorize, that the concept of clinging applied quite often to how war and civilization cling to each other? Well, this is finally a time when something like that becomes very important. My theory for what the Secret to Immortality Weiqi game represents is that it is a metaphor for humanity's struggle against the Lament. Now that we are already deep within the Renacita and Septimont storyline, we know that after Imperator fused with Leviathan, we learned that Frenodians, by nature, are effectively unkillable, because their very existence depends on human civilization. Just like how Changli's Li hexagram represents clinging as well as war and civilization, Frenodians and Sentinels, as well as the humanity they represent, are effectively codependent on each other for existence. Humanities and Sentinels fight against the Lament and the Frenodians, but Frenodians themselves can only exist because civilizations manifest them. If the legendary Weiqi game is anything to go by, then it foreshadows that in this game on which the fate of the world rests, Frenodians and Sentinels are destined to fight each other forever, being trapped in a sort of stalemate and limbo. However, within the original Weiqi game between Rover and Changli's master, even though it is logically endless, there are technically two ways you can end the game. The first method is for one side to essentially voluntarily concede by playing a different move, which will essentially break the cycle and probably cause them to lose. And the other is to restart the entire game from the beginning. Both of these potential endings for the game may, in my opinion, quite realistically foreshadow the entire fate of the world of Wuthering Waves. Perhaps the war between humanity and Lament can only end if one side surrenders or falls, or if a sort of massive event causes a complete reset of the world to essentially a ground zero state. Only time can tell who will be the final victor in a game that neither can win. Although the most important Weiqi board is undoubtedly the legendary game between her master and rover, there exists one more board that not a lot of people have paid attention to. Within the game played at the end of the story, as well as the one shown within her convene animation, we see a board that is an exact replica of the 65th move in a match between Shi Shangsha and Fan Shiping, two very famous Weiqi players from 18th century China, whose matches have actually been recorded in a book, hence the reference. Within Changli's convene animation, she plays the 65th move of white, burning away the pieces. In summary, as was explained by Wulu Weiqi, this is because, to put it simply, it is a strategically masterful move that places black in a very bad position to respond, as they must themselves be put in a terrible position to counterattack. In perhaps more understandable, let's just say Western terms, this would be the equivalent of playing a knight into a position that checks the opponent's king, with the only enemy piece that can counteract it being the queen to capture the knight, but the knight's position being forked by a bishop ready to take whatever is on the knight's tile. In essence, what this game represents is not really anything about the fate of the world per se, like the previous Weiqi game that we talked about, but more so about Changli's own strategic acumen and ability to manipulate situations to put her enemies in bad positions, such as within her Sonoro sphere and throughout the story. Wulu Weiqi summarized it pretty nicely. If black attempts to kill this white stone played at move 65, they will suffer a significant disadvantage, just as Changli excels at perceiving and leveraging human nature to lure opponents into a trap. Essentially, instead of sticking forever to the legendary game record between her master and rover, Changli is determined to forge her own destiny and legacy. Through her first cherished item, she says the following as she sits down to have a game with Rover. Now that the worthy opponent she has been seeking stands before her, another historic game to be remembered and studied for centuries shall take place. As long as the players remain, the pages will continue to be filled. A further third and final Weiqi board makes an appearance within Changli's Resonator showcase when she is playing against Jinzhou and advising her on the course forward. This game is a mirror to the 105th move of the 1955 game between Kaku Takagawa and Wu Qingyun, where White had to connect and rescue their nearly dead grouping in the upper right corner, eventually gaining a very hard-won victory despite being initially disadvantaged. I will again leave Wulu Weiqi to explain the potential meaning of this part. Changli means that by this point of the game, a fierce fight has become unavoidable, so there's no need to hesitate or be confused. Instead, one should seize the initiative, which is exactly what Changli achieved on the board. She took control and turned the tide. Now, I think personally that this game between Jinzhou and Changli, the two figures that will guide Jinzhou into the future, is symbolic of the Huanglong storyline itself. After the events of Jinzhou and Mount Firmament, which nearly plunged the entire region into calamity, the world has barely been saved from the destructive jaws of the Lament. While Jinzhou uses the symbolism of the spring and the Jinzhou to basically allude to the fact that the hard winter of the past has given way to the hope of the present, Changli expresses the same outcome through a game of Weiqi. Despite the fight being hard and inevitable, Victory, though difficult, will allow the triumph for the people of Jinzhou. Alternatively, if we are to link this to the legendary game record between Rover and Changli's master, we can make the interpretation that perhaps this game between Changli and Jinzhou symbolizes the fight between Freneauts and Sentinels that we discussed previously. It could be that the fierce, unavoidable fight on the Weiqi board is this confrontation between humanity and its vices in the form of the Lament, and Changli believes that if this is the case, one must act and seize the initiative. Perhaps, at the end of the road of a hard fight that this Weiqi might symbolizes, humanity will eventually emerge victorious. As always, thank you very much for watching if you got this far. This was definitely my hardest video to do research-wise, so I hope you enjoy my little in-between between Augusta and Iono. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you hopefully when it's time to talk about classical priestesses.
The young orphan girl carried on. Everywhere she looked, tragedies rampant. As lament engulfed the globe, a world torn by monsters, filled with homeless souls. With her own blood as fire, she drove away the cold. And her master said, "In this tumultuous world, lives are fragile as mayflies." She couldn't exhaust herself to save those before her. But she must endure to ignite a brighter tomorrow. She wielded her wits to evade harm, treading on knives with care, alone, yet maturing through stumbles. Later on, she became someone else's teacher. She taught the future leader this: to guide conscience and secure prosperity for the people, to continue lost teachings of past sages and establish peace for all. I will be the torchbearer, for one person can't rid the world of chaos alone. One day, a future of prosperity and lasting peace will arrive.